Welcome to our lecture discussion of the skeletal system. You'll find these notes in the lecture folder under the skeletal system. Be sure that you've printed off this PowerPoint and that you have the same PowerPoint in front of you as you see on the screen here. This is the first page of the PowerPoint. I did update these notes, so if your picture on your PowerPoint matches what you see on the screen, then you know you have the updated copy. We're going to start our discussion today by watching a little video about bone, just to get some real-life practical applications of bone. So we'll watch this 5-minute video.
Follow any muscle to its base through a bundle of strong, flexible fibers called tendons, down to the very point where it's anchored, and you'll find one of the world's most remarkable materials: bone. Some 206 of these engineering marvels are strewn throughout the body, strong enough to support up to 20 times our body weight, light enough to defy gravity, however briefly, flexible enough to absorb unfathomable impacts, and connected in such a way so as to provide a seemingly endless range of movement. Accounting for some 15% of our body mass, bones are what give us our shape. Without them, we would all look like this. But despite the amazing strength and support our inner frameworks provide, they've had a pretty bad rap. Descend 60 feet under the streets of Paris, into its catacombs hundreds of years old, and we get the stereotypical image of bone: dry, sterile, white, dead. That's not exactly surprising. This is the only way most of us ever get to see bones. And not to be too morbid, but these are the only bits of us that are going to be left. This was the world's first glimpse of bone inside a living human body. The left hand of Frau Bertha Röntgen, as imaged in 1895 by her husband, Wilhelm Röntgen, discoverer of the X-ray. We've come a long way since then, and it turns out bones are anything but dry. Deep in the center of many bones, in this tissue called the marrow, some 120 million oxygen-carrying red blood cells and 7 million microbe-fighting white blood cells are born every minute and shipped off to the rest of the body. Toward the surface, specialized cells continually lay down new bone, while others do the opposite and whisk old layers away. This is how bone grows with us throughout our youth and keeps itself strong long after we're grown. If we suck away all that marrow, we see bone is mainly a blend of two substances: the mineral calcium phosphate and the protein collagen. It's a match made in heaven. Without flexible collagen, bone would be as brittle as glass. Without calcium phosphate, it would be as unstructured as rubber. Together, they're light enough to maneuver, strong enough to shelter our most delicate inner organs, and resilient enough to last a lifetime.
Go.
Champion gymnasts like Joey Haggerty routinely push the limits of bone. They train them to grow and adapt to extremes.
Hey, Joe, ready?
Sports physiologist Bill Sands tries to ensure this isn't past the breaking point.
Bone's a living tissue like all other living tissues, so the function, the things we ask the tissue to do, as long as we provide those stimuli carefully, slowly, progressively, we can usually get tissues to withstand astonishing things.
It is this adaptive property of bone that allows a martial arts expert to punch straight through concrete.
You don't do that the first day, of course. I mean, you have to build them up more and more and more over probably multiple years.
The same goes for gymnasts, whose bones absorb a tremendous amount of shock.
Yeah, don't hook your toes, just look.
Sands uses a variety of apparatuses to measure this,
To your right.
like these inserts that measure the forces on Joey's feet, and high-speed cameras to record the impact.
3, 2, 1, go. Well, right here, he's over 150 pounds per square inch. Trust me, that's a big force. The forces generally seen in gymnastics are the biggest forces that I think that we've had recorded so far, in the 14 to 20-ish times body weight.
All right, so a little interesting factoids about bone, and we'll talk about those a little bit more as they relate to our discussion today. So looking at the function of the skeletal system, the function, there's several. An important function is to support. So we support our muscles and our organs throughout our body cavities by the bony outer cavities. For example, the thoracic cavity is surrounded by the ribs we learned in lab, and the cranial cavity is surrounded by the skull, and the vertebral cavity is surrounded by the spine. So it supports and protects those organs inside them. So any organ with a bony protection is much safer from injury and trauma than those, say, for example, in the digestive cavity or the peritoneal cavity of the digestive organs, where we find those are more prone to injury, say in automobile accidents, because they don't have that bony protection. For movement, muscles attach to bone and bones connect together at joints, which allow us to move. So together with muscles, the skeletal system promotes movement. Storage, we can store fat in the inside of our bones, in the cavity, the medullary cavity inside of our bones, as well as we can store calcium. So when we are short on calcium in the blood, our bones will break down to release that calcium in the bone to give it to the blood. And we'll learn when we study the muscular system why calcium is so important. Blood cell production, the video mentioned how our red and white blood cells are found in the bone marrow, and we're constantly producing new red and white blood cells, and these again are formed inside of our bones in what's called the bone marrow. So looking at a typical long bone structure, this picture is found in your textbook. The ends of our bones of a typical long bone are called the epiphyses. So this enlarged end and this enlarged end is called an epiphysis. The shaft of a bone, the long part of the bone, is called the diaphysis. So we have the epiphysis on the end, and the diaphysis is the long shaft of the bone. So think of epiphysis starts with an E and end starts with the E. They both are found on the ends of bones, the epiphyses. What we find in the diaphysis is a hollowed out central portion, which is called the medullary cavity. And what fills the medullary cavity is bone marrow. And the type of bone marrow depends upon the age of the bone and the age of the individual. For example, if someone is 5 years old, a child who's still developing their immune system, we would find red marrow inside the diaphysis. If you're looking at someone who is 40 years old, who already has a well-developed immune system, we would find this would be filled with yellow marrow. Yellow marrow is mostly fat. Red marrow contains the red and white blood cells for carrying oxygen in terms of red blood cells, or fighting infection with the white blood cells. So if we look at the type of tissue that makes up long bones, we find that there's compact bone on the edge here of the diaphysis, and in the epiphyses we find a different type of bone, which is called spongy bone, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple slides. But for right now, know the major parts of the long bone: the epiphyses, the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, that hollowed out region inside that's filled with red or yellow marrow. In this picture it shows it as yellow marrow. On the outside layer of bone we have a special lining, I guess we could call it, which is the periosteum that lines the outside of bone, and underneath the periosteum are bone cells that secrete collagen fibers and assemble the bone matrix, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit as well. So we have compact bone here, which is solid bone with no spaces in between the bone, and then we have spongy bone here in the epiphyses that has these spaces for more bone marrow to fill in, and also we can see blood vessels migrate through this spongy bone as well. In the epiphyses, we find there's a special area of growth, which is called the epiphyseal plate during childhood and early puberty, but when the skeleton is done growing, that plate turns into a line, and it just looks like a solid line of bone. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well, but it's called the line when the bone is done growing, and it's called the plate when this bone is still growing in length. So here's an example. Here's the medullary cavity, this hollowed out central region of the diaphysis, which is filled with yellow marrow. Again, in children, it would be red marrow, which means instead of just being adipose tissue here, as we see in yellow marrow, we would see red and white blood cells if it was red marrow filling this region. In adults, we still need an immune system, and we still need red blood cells. So where we find red marrow in adults is in the spongy bone of the epiphyses, and also in spongy bone that we might find in flat bones. For example, in the ilium of the hip, we would see spongy bone there filled with red bone marrow. And that is a common sight of people that want to donate bone marrow to a genetic match who's in need of a bone marrow transplant. For example, someone who is diagnosed with leukemia, they would go to that ilium bone to retrieve the bone marrow to transplant to that person who has leukemia. Now you have something on Blackboard. It's a worksheet that covers the different structures of bone. I would recommend that you go and find that right now, print it off, and we're going to label these structures together. So looking at this diagram here we can see compact bone tissue. We looked at this when we studied the tissues. So each circular unit has a special name, and each repeating circular unit is called an osteon. So right here in this square, you want to write the word osteon, O-S-T-E-N. And I could probably go ahead and put a text box there, and we could label it an osteon. Whoops. And then on the right side here are some more structures. What we see on the right hand side in the center of each osteon is a space where blood vessels and nerves run through the center of each osteon, and this is called the central canal. Another name for this is the Haversian canal. Again, it contains artery, vein, and nerve, because we know bone, when it's broken, causes bruising because there's blood leaking out into the tissues, and also we can feel a broken bone. It's very painful because of the nerves that supply each osteon in compact bone. The next structure we're going to talk about in this picture is the bone cell that actually makes the matrix, which makes the white part of bone that we see, like if you look at a chicken bone or the skulls that we talked about in lab. Those are made up of bone, compact bone, and the white solid bone that we see is made up of special bone cells. There's some bone cells that make the bone, and then as that bone ossifies and hardens, then the bone cell changes its name and it simply maintains the bone. And sometimes our bone needs to be broken down to release calcium or to remodel or repair a fracture, or during that growth or repair period, we call those another type of bone cell. So this bone cell here that's just maintaining bone, we call that an osteocyte. So these are cells that maintain bone, and if you look in the picture, they kind of look like spider-like structures. They have these long fibers on them extending away. Those are actually extensions of the cell that reach into the bone matrix and allow these cells to absorb and absorb nutrients and dispose of waste throughout this matrix. So these tiny little extensions of the cell actually form tiny canals through the bone matrix, and what we call them are canaliculi. So I'm going to fill that in here, canaliculi. And they extend throughout the cell, or throughout the bone, to allow the cells to communicate with one another. So there's these small cellular extensions, essentially, that form indentations in the matrix when the bone matrix hardens, and it looks like tiny little fibers or hair-like threads within the bone matrix, and those again are called canaliculi. So specialized cells that make bone matrix, we call those osteoblasts. Osteoblasts build bone. Cells that break down bone are called osteoclasts. These will take over when we need calcium in the blood. For example, if we're not getting enough calcium in our diet, we need calcium for muscle contraction, so our heart cannot beat if we don't have sufficient calcium in our blood. So what happens is osteoclasts will be stimulated to break down bone to release calcium to the blood. So that's why it's always important that we're getting enough calcium in our diet. And the bone cells that maintain bone matrix, those are what we labeled above, those are called osteocytes. So think of blasts build, clasts cleave, which means like a cleaver breaking things down, and osteocytes maintain. So osteoblasts build, osteoclasts cleave or break down, and osteocytes simply maintain. Going to the next page of the handout, we see the different parts of a long bone. On the upper left-hand side, we have on the top and bottom, we have the epiphyses. Epiphysis is how you would pronounce that. And on the bottom would be the same thing, the epiphysis. In the middle here, we have the diaphysis. That's the shaft of the bone. And here, this would be the epiphyseal plate. Looks like it's thick, has some cartilage there, or it might be a line if it's in an adult. And the type of bone we find in the epiphyses, do you remember? It's called spongy bone. And this hollowed out central region is the medullary cavity. So be sure that you can look at a blank diagram and be able to fill in the parts in both this tissue slide of compact bone as well as this diagram of a long bone. This will definitely be on the test. Be sure you know how to label both of those. All right, moving on then, looking at bone. What makes up bone? Here we can see this is bone matrix, just what you see with bone. We can't see the individual cells that make the bone. We'd have to have a microscope for that. Same thing with looking at individual osteons. You wouldn't be able to see that without a microscope. So if we look at a typical bone, it's made of two things, collagen and calcium. So if you want to write the word calcium here, that would be more specific. I think it just says mineral, but the mineral they're referring to is calcium. So what this is showing here is if we didn't have calcium, our bones would be too flexible and it wouldn't support us. Like a person who has rickets has not had enough calcium in their diet, and as a result their bones are overly flexible. They're not hard enough. If we didn't have enough collagen, our bones become brittle. And collagen is something that our body cells produce, but over time collagen breaks down and collagen production slows down. So as a result, our bones are more subject to breaking as we age because they become a little more fragile because of decreased collagen. So we talked about the cells already. We'll just kind of refresh our memory about that. These cells have these long extensions, again, that help them communicate with one another. They're called canaliculi, or one of them is a canaliculus. But these cells, depending on what their job is, they have different names. Osteo always is a prefix referring to bone. So osteoblasts are bone cells that build bone. So they assemble the bone matrix and they secrete collagen fibers to make that bone. Osteocytes are mature bone cells that maintain that bone once it's made. And osteoclasts are those cells that we said break down or resorb the bone matrix when we need to release calcium to the blood, for example. Or if we're building new bone and we're hollowing out the medullary cavity with new bone being built by the osteoblast, we have osteoclast activity working at the same time. And this happens throughout our life. We're constantly remodeling our bone. So looking at compact bone again, in this nice little diagram here, we can see that we have these repeating circular units that are called osteons. Another name are Haversian systems, but I would prefer you use the word osteon. And the osteons are made up of repeating layers of bone, and with the newest bone being closest to the Haversian canal or central canal, and the oldest bone being on the edge. But each layer of bone that's secreted by the bone cells is called a lamella. So lamella means layer. Lamella, layer. And we can see the bone cells that lie along each layer. And as the bone hardens around them, it forms cavities in the bone where these osteocytes lie. And the cavities around an osteocyte, here we can see a cavity around this osteocyte, those are called lacuna. So lacuna with a hard C means cavity. Lamella means layer of bone. So this is a lamella, a layer of bone. And this dark cavity around this osteocyte, that's called a lacuna. So in looking at this tissue slide down here, we can see the lacuna would be the darkly stained areas where we would also find an osteocyte. So I could use the same arrow and refer to an osteocyte or a lacuna, because it's hard to tell one from the other when you're looking at a tissue slide, because it only shows up as a black spot. So here we can see blood vessels running down the center of each osteon through these central canals, but we also have blood vessels that run horizontally through the bone, so we can get blood away from this bone and back to the general blood supply. These vessels that run horizontally are called Volkmann's canal. So they run horizontally through the bone or perpendicular to the long axis of the bone. So this is the long axis. These Volkmann's canal vessels run perpendicular, and you'll notice they connect every central canal as it runs horizontally through the bone. So here's a nice blown up view of a tissue slide. Remember, histology is the study of tissues, so if we're looking at this slide, we're looking at a tissue of compact bone. Again, the lacuna shows up as a dark spot, and that's just a cavity where an osteocyte would be found. So lacuna means cavity, and there would be an osteocyte in that cavity if this were a living bone. Again, the lamella are just the layers of bone. Here's a layer of bone here and a layer of bone here. Sometimes we find layers of bone, not sometimes, all the time, we will find layers of bone between the osteons. And again, just any layer of bone, whether it's circular or not circular, as in this interstitial layer of bone, it's still called a lamella, which is just a layer. Just think of the word lamella, has 3 L's in it, and it refers to layers of bone. So spongy bone is found in the epiphyses of our bones, or it's found between the bones of flat bones, such as in the skull. And there's these open spaces, and we can see there's blood vessels that permeate through the spaces in the bone, and these bony pieces here that we see in spongy bone, those are called trabeculae. And these trabeculae can actually grow and align themselves along the direction of stress. For example, in the video of the martial art gentleman who was hitting his forehead up against the concrete blocks, over time, as he continues to hit his head, he'll start with, probably plastic boards, and then working his way up to the concrete blocks over years. Over time, his trabeculae will realign themselves to become stronger as he hits his head against those boards. And that is our body's way of adapting to stresses placed on bone. The same thing with the gymnast when they were measuring the force on his bones of his legs as he lands after a jump or a flip. Those trabeculae will become stronger and stronger as they respond to the demands placed on them. Factors that affect how well bone grows, there's a number of factors. One is our nutrition. Vitamin D is necessary in our diet in order to absorb calcium from our digestive tract. So if you drink a glass of milk, there's calcium present there. We'll need vitamin D in our body to help absorb that calcium. So you'll notice every bottle or every gallon of milk at the grocery store will say vitamin D fortified. So that's a benefit of buying benefit of buying milk at the grocery store is they do fortify it with vitamin D. If you live on a farm and you drink milk straight from the bulk tank on the dairy farm, it is not vitamin D fortified. So therefore it'd be important for people to get enough sunlight, because we learned when we studied skin that vitamin D is a vitamin that begins its production by exposing the skin to sunlight. But here in the Midwest, especially in the wintertime, we definitely don't get enough sun exposure, so having vitamin D supplementation in our milk is really important. Vitamin C is another important nutritional factor for a healthy skeleton, because we need that for collagen synthesis. So those osteoblasts that make the collagen fibers, collagen is a protein, so with the help of ribosomes, the rough ER, the Golgi apparatus, we make collagen in our bone matrix to keep our bones flexible. And if we don't have sufficient collagen or vitamin C, we can end up with something called scurvy. This was a problem among sailors that left on ships for months at a time when they didn't have exposure to fresh fruits and vegetables and they lacked vitamin C. They would end up with broken blood vessels because of blood vessels have a collagen connective tissue wrapping, and excessive bruising, hemorrhaging, and fractures. So as a result, they found out that by sending limes on the boats with the sailors, that those were a rich source of vitamin C and helped to prevent scurvy. So you may hear in pirate movies how they refer to one another as limeys, and limeys was the name given to people on ships because they had to eat limes when they were out at sea to prevent scurvy from vitamin C deficiencies. 3 different hormones we need to support our skeleton. We have growth hormone that's secreted throughout our life. That's very important. If we have too much growth hormone, you end up with gigantism, like Andre the Giant had too much growth hormone. Or not enough growth hormone, you end up with people that are what we classify as midgets. That's different from dwarfism. Midgets are proportionally small people with a smaller than average skeleton. Thyroid hormone has many different functions within the body, one of which is growth of our tissues. So insufficient thyroid hormone is definitely something that needs to be addressed among children because it can stunt their growth. The sex hormones estrogen and testosterone also contribute to growth, and we know that estrogen acts faster on the skeleton than testosterone does, but testosterone acts longer. So for example, if you look in a typical 6th grade classroom, you'll notice that the girls are taller than the boys because both are going through puberty, but the estrogen acts faster on bone and testosterone takes a little longer to get that bone growth complete. As a result, women are usually done growing by age 18, where men usually finish their growth by age 21. Of course, there's individual variances on either side of that, where some people hit their growth spurt sooner than later, and vice versa. So throughout our life, we're constantly breaking down and replacing old bone with new bone. We call this bone remodeling. Just like in your kitchen, if you want to remodel your kitchen, you tear down the old cabinets and you put up the new cabinets. So the same thing happens with our bone. We remove bone via osteoclasts. So osteoclasts remove bone, and osteoblasts add bone. So when we're growing bone, this growth occurs at the epiphyseal plate, which we talked about earlier. This is this area, it's an area of cartilage where you have cartilage growing on the superior end and ossification of the cartilage on the inferior end. As a result, the bone grows in length until growth is complete at the end of puberty, and then this hyaline cartilage completely ossifies and you have no more replacement of cartilage on the superior end. Bone remodeling, on the other hand, occurs on the outside of our bone, not at the growth plate, because that's now a line when we're done growing, but we add new bone on the outside of bone and we break down the old bone on the inside here. So we're adding new and breaking down the old on this side. So as a result, our bones are constantly being remodeled, and it takes about 10 years for a whole brand new skeleton. And of course, as we age, this process slows down, and we find that osteoclast activity is beating out osteoblast activity, especially in women. after menopause, because estrogen stimulates osteoblasts, and without estrogen, osteoblast activity decreases. So therefore, women after menopause are more prone to fractures. As a result, it's important that they get enough calcium in their diet as well as vitamin D to absorb that calcium. Some doctors will definitely recommend calcium supplementation after menopause if a woman does not have a good supply of calcium in her diet. So when you break a bone, we know that compact bone is made up of osteons, of which there's a good blood supply running through the center of each osteon with having its own artery and vein. And as a result, if we break those osteons, that's going to cause a leaking of blood throughout the tissue where the break occurred, and we get what's called a hematoma. And a hematoma is simply a swelling under the skin that is full of blood. So this is the first thing that happens when someone breaks a bone. You're going to see bruising and swelling at the site of the break. Then, over time, cartilage starts to fill in that broken area, fill in that space of damaged compact bone, and this is a very fragile tissue. So this is when we would definitely want to have that bone set. We'd want to have that bone in a cast at this time to make sure that it's not healing in the wrong position. It's very, very important that it be set. And that's why, because of the good blood supply, this healing can happen very quickly, and it's important to get that bone looked at so it doesn't begin to heal improperly. So within a week after the break, we find this bony callus forms, and this is trabeculae that have formed a new spongy bone due to osteoblasts coming in here, and it forms this bridge here. But again, we know that the diaphysis of a bone should have a medullary cavity. So in the meantime, this is stabilizing that break until the compact bone can be completely repaired here. So we have some spongy bone spanning the break until, over time, which usually takes about 2 months, for the compact bone to be completely replaced with new bone, and then osteoclasts will come in and remove that bridge of spongy bone that was formed with the bony callus. So know these order of steps when it comes to bone repair. The first thing we get is the hematoma, then we get some fibrocartilage spanning the break, and then the bony callus, which is made up of spongy bone, and then eventually osteoclasts will cleave out that bony callus, and the compact bone is replaced by new compact bone, which usually takes about 2 months. Children are quick healers. Sometimes they can heal completely in less than 2 months, and the elderly, which take a longer time to heal, that can take longer than 2 months. So there's some variation on either side of that. So we talked about calcium being very important to bone. It's also important in our blood. So when we build bone, we're adding calcium to our bone. When we're breaking down bone, we're losing calcium from the bone. And we know that if we have a balance between osteoclast and osteoblast activity, we're not losing bone over time. But as we age, osteoclast activity continues over and beyond osteoblast activity, because for women, like I said, it's the lack of estrogen and declining testosterone levels in men. So what happens as a result of that is we get bone fractures, because we weaken the trabeculae when we lose calcium from bone. And as that trabeculae weakens, it will weaken the bone, and what happens is the head of the femur, or the neck here of the femur, will break in some women or men who fall on their hip that have osteoporosis, or if someone could even be just standing at the stove and that fragile neck breaks due to weakening trabeculae and they fall down. So it's not a matter of falling and breaking the hip, but it's breaking the hip and falling. And that is something that can happen when the bones are weak and fragile, as we see in this picture of osteoporosis. So how do we prevent that? Well, we know that weight-bearing exercise stimulates osteoblasts. So people who walk a lot, people who use the stairs on a regular basis, people who lift weights, those are all examples of weight-bearing exercise that are going to be good for building bone throughout the lifespan. If someone lives a sedentary lifestyle, they are putting themselves at risk for osteoporosis later in life if they don't have a good diet of calcium. Or even if they do have a good diet, sometimes we need the extra benefit of weight-bearing exercise to keep our bones strong. So when you look at a thin, frail, elderly woman who doesn't exercise or hasn't been overly active in her life, that is a major risk factor for osteoporosis. So it's important for women throughout the lifespan to get weight-bearing exercise and activity. And they found this to be particularly true when they would send astronauts out into space, into that zero gravity or very low gravity environment. Without that weight-bearing exercise built into their day, that their bone mass would decrease. So now we know when we send astronauts out into space for months at a time that they have to do exercises. And without weights, it's hard to do weight-bearing, so I'm sure they use something like the rubber bands or those machines that you stretch bands to get that resistance on your muscles and your bones. So as we age, bone matrix, which means the calcium and collagen that make up our bone, decreases. The bone, as a result of that, the bone mass decreases, and that puts us at risk for fractures. So to slow that process, a good diet of calcium and vitamin D and vitamin C, as well as weight-bearing exercise, is going to slow this aging process. As we lose bone, people with osteoporosis end up with a hunched back as they get compression fractures in their vertebrae, as their spine changes and compresses and curves forward. We see a loss of height. It causes pain and stiffness because those bones no longer glide against each other like they should. And as we lose bone in the jaw, of the mandible and the maxilla, then the teeth begin to fall out. Sometimes elderly people are disappointed to find that they lose teeth when they've had meticulous oral care their whole life. What we can share then, if our patients or residents that we care for ask about this, you can tell them that that's just part of the aging process when we lose some bone in the jaw, in the upper and lower jaw, that losing teeth is a side effect of that. So here's some interesting medical applications of the skeletal system. This is taken from your textbook if you'd like to read about this a little bit more. But hip replacements and knee replacements are a common thing in today's society. Sometimes people are born with just poor alignment of the hip joint, and it causes the cartilage to wear away between the femur and the acetabulum of the os coxa bone. As a result, they remove the head of the femur and replace it with a titanium metal head, and then they line the acetabulum with a artificial material to allow those two parts to glide against each other relatively friction and pain-free. The knee, the same thing. Athletes, people who have had injuries to the knee resulting in poor alignment, or lifelong obesity that simply wears away the knee because of carrying extra weight on the skeleton, those people will need a knee replacement. And what they do is they remove and shave down the top of the tibia, and they remove and reshape the bottom of the femur to create new surfaces that glide against each other appropriately with a new kneecap. And we can see what those pieces look like here in this x-ray. Biggest problem or challenge to joint replacements is infection. Anytime we put artificial materials into the body, bone is sterile, and any type of bacteria can invade these areas that are not part of the body and cause infection. So that's the number one complication of hip and knee replacements. And this risk increases greatly for people that have type 2 or type 1 diabetes, because that high sugar environment promotes infection if blood sugar is not well controlled, and if their immune system is not functioning the way it should, that puts them at extra risk for infection. Here it's talking about how we're actually moving toward having robots perform the drilling and some of the major skills involved with hip and knee replacements. Again, you can read more about this in your textbook. I was able to actually watch a knee replacement during one of my nursing clinicals, and it was really very interesting. And it's quite a graphic surgery. You know, they're using saws and chisels and hammers, and it's quite a surgery to watch. Something not to be taken lightly, because you know, major risk for infection and all that. But Definitely for patients that have undergone hip and knee surgery, it does wonders for their pain, and if it promotes people to being active again and losing the weight and participating in life, it's definitely worth that. And there's many people that have had successful hip and knee surgeries that have lived many years and lived very active lives afterward. So that includes our discussion of the skeletal system physiology. Be sure that you get into our lab folder and print off the flashcards, because there's flashcards that you need to create for all the bones of the skeleton. That's in the lab folder, and you'll turn those lab flashcards in when you take your lab exam, so be sure that you print those off well ahead of your lab exam so you can use them to study for the lab exam, and then you'll turn those into your proctor when you take your lab exam. I also like to meet with each of you here coming up soon, so we can set up a time for that. I'll put some times out on Blackboard for you to sign up to come and meet with me for a midterm kind of get-together, so we can get to see one another and I can answer any questions you have. I can learn a little bit about you. And if that happens to be before the next lab exam, then you could bring your flashcards when we meet. Either one would be fine with me. All right, thank you, and have a good day.